I hear my next guest here. I can see him in the background. Caleb Maupin. How you doing, my man? You doing okay, Caleb?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I am doing well. I'm doing well. Dragging a bit of ass today, but I'm okay. Caleb Maupin, he's a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. His new book, I have it right here, just so the audience can see, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. I am super curious about this. I am very curious about this. You have no idea how I was eager to hear this interview. I'm glad you hit me up and asked me about it. And you can also find Caleb. He's started the Center for Political Innovation. Caleb, that is an interesting title. And just so the audience can see the book itself, you can get it on Amazon right here. Let's put it up for the audience to see. I watched you do what I'm going to call a sermon yesterday with this title for this book. And he was like, when I was a boy, 15 years old, selling the thing. And I thought to myself, I was like, Caleb, how does it feel selling that first communist magazine under false pretenses? The guy thought you were a college student from the Orville. But no, it's Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. And you put, for decades, people have debated the strange link between Leo Trotsky's followers and the rise of neoconservatism, but rarely has the full story been told. And you pointed out yesterday that you had this stuff kind of in your mind, like you knew about the stuff. You had already did the research, but you had to compile it and put it in a way that made sense for people. I think most Americans would ask the very basic question: what does Trotsky, communists, have to do with conservatives, or let's say neoconservatives here in the United States, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, the Trumps of the world, the et ceteras of the world? How are these two things related to one another? They seem to be very disparate. They seem to be very different politically.
Yeah, well, ever since the Bush years, people have pointed out that some of the top war hawks and academic war strategists in the United States, if you trace their careers back, they were Marxists, socialists, and followers of Leon Trotsky. And Irving Kristol, he's the father of Bill Kristol, the guy who does the Weekly Standard. Carl Gershman, who headed the National Endowment for Democracy. Gene Kirkpatrick, who is Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations. You can make a whole list of these people. They were at one point Trotskyists, followers of Leon Trotsky. And that is something that's been pointed out for a long time, and you don't really get clear answers about why that is. The standard, the first answer we heard from like Alex Jones and others is they would say, well, these people hate freedom, right? The neocons, Bush did the Patriot Act, it was taking away our freedom, and communists also hate freedom, so that's where this comes from. Well, that's a little bit simplistic. And then nowadays, the reason that, this book is getting some play, Nick Fuentes and others are just playing up the fact, well, all these people are Jews, they say, right? And that this is, they played like this general anti-Semitic thing. Communism is Jewish. These people are Jewish Zionists. And so it's like a Jewish thing. That's not the issue either. I am the only one to ever just sit down and write an entire book on this relationship, on this strange trajectory that over the course of, World War II, and then the 50s and 60s and 70s, you had a layer of people that went from, the far left and the socialist groups of New York City all the way to the Republican Party and strategizing U.S. Foreign policy for the Republicans and being advocates of U.S. regime change wars. And where did that come from? And there is a trajectory, and I tell that story in this book, and I show that there is a little bit of a continuity. It's not a conspiracy, but there is a little bit of an intellectual continuity. And there's a trajectory that a number of intellectuals in New York City, they called them the New York Intellectuals, a group centered around Partisan Review magazine. There's a way that they ended up being the neocons and the war hawks, who now the Trump administration is purging, right? You saw that John Bolton had his home raided by the FBI, and Tulsi Gabbard has stripped these folks of their security clearances. A number of the neocons and the CIA have lost their security clearances. MSNBC, I don't know if you saw, is lying. They're claiming that Tulsi Gabbard revealed the identity of a covert CIA operative. And that's not true, but she can't defend herself because as director of national intelligence, she cannot discuss the status of a CIA operative. So they have an individual who was publicly part of the CIA. They changed her status to covert and are now coordinating with the Wall Street Journal and MSNBC to claim Tulsi Gabbard revealed her identity. That's not what happened, right? And that there is all kinds of crazy stuff going on in the back room right now. We have U.S. warships threatening Venezuela. And on top of that, we have, at the same time, we have the Russiagate, indictments in the works and possibly prosecuting the people who lied. But if you want to talk about neocons, let's just talk about the facts. John Bolton and his crowd of people, the neoconservatives, the people who were trained as Sovietologists in the 70s and 80s, who studied the Soviet Union, they lied to get us into the war in Iraq. They said there were weapons of mass destruction when there weren't any. They said Iraq was part of 9/11, which they weren't. That led to at least 100,000 deaths, millions of refugees, a whole country destroyed. Then they lied about Russiagate. And that lie of Russiagate was essential to the war in Ukraine happening. The war in Ukraine would not have happened if Trump had been able to come into office and reset and improve relations with Russia, if Biden hadn't been able to take the White House with the FBI cooperating with him to suppress the Hunter Biden laptop scandal, all of that set the stage for the war that we're in now. So the neocons, they lied about weapons of mass destruction, and they lied about Russia meddling in the U.S. elections, and their lies have led to hundreds of thousands of people dying. But now we're in the possible situation where we could see a precedent set with the prosecution of John Bolton and the prosecution of the Russiagators. It could actually become a crime to do what they did. And that would be a huge breakthrough if there was an understanding that if you lie to the American people and you lie to the U.S. public and you cook the books and intelligence and it leads to a war, you could actually be prosecuted. That would be a great thing. And so what is happening right now, if Tulsi Gabbard can actually go ahead and secure the prosecution of John Bolton and the neocons, that would be a huge victory for America's working families, a huge victory for world peace. And I'm really hoping that can move ahead. As much as it might seem like a long shot, it looks like there's a very good chance of it happening.
Agreed. I hope it does also. I have no issue doing so. By the same token, that same administration that is prosecuting political opponents for lying to the American public and getting us involved in wars and preventing us, meaning I don't think people fully grasp the degree to which the Russiagate stuff had in poisoning the well of getting anything done in regards to stopping the conflict. Well, you got like 30% of the country thinking that Putin got Trump elected. And so now all of this stuff is radioactive and you can't really do anything about it. That stuff is horrendous, right? So I agree with you. By the same token, Donald Trump is trying to make this argument that drugs are the reason that he sent a warship with hundreds of Tomahawk missiles and 4,000 Marines at a nuclear sub off the coast of Venezuela. I mean, the bombing of Yemen, the bombing of Iran, claiming that Iran is trying to get a bomb. I'm not, put it this way, if they're going to prosecute the Democrats for doing this, then they should also be prosecuted for doing this. I guess that's my thing on this. I don't.
Yeah, well, we have to understand the nuances of all of this. There's many layers to this, and it gets very, very weird. There's many layers, but like one layer is that U.S. intelligence has used the Muslim Brotherhood as their main proxy in the Middle East for a long time. The Arab Spring would not have happened without Al Jazeera, based in Qatar, funded by the Qatari monarchy, without the Muslim Brotherhood, the westernized Sunni Muslims, acting as the foot soldiers of the United States to destabilize Libya, to destabilize Syria, to do what they did in 2011. And that, the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas was originally the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. It, established its independence. So you have this weird situation where on the one hand, the United States, is supporting Israel. On the other hand, you have this, kind of branch of Islam, of Sunni Islam, the westernized wing of Sunni Islam that acts as, the main allies of the United States in the Middle East. And you have the United States doing kind of a balancing act. And so the Trump administration, there's even talk they may declare the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization as a favor to Israel. Meanwhile, the liberals and the Democratic Socialists of America have basically embedded themselves with the Muslim Brotherhood. And Mahmoud Khalil, who Donald Trump tried to deport from the country for his anti-Israel activism, Mahmoud Khalil was a U.S. intelligence operative trying to bring down the Syrian Arab Republic. And Zoran Mamdani, his wife, is also a regime change activist tied in with the Muslim Brotherhood. So we have this situation where there are different interests. I believe that Donald Trump is threatening Venezuela because he's trying to appease Marco Rubio's faction. Marco Rubio is part of, Maduro called them the Miami Mafia, the layer of people that have been displaced by socialist revolutions in Latin America. And they are reluctantly having to go along with Trump as he tries to improve relations with Russia. So he's throwing them a bone and he's saying, all right, you can mess with Venezuela. You can threaten Venezuela. Venezuela is prepared to defend itself. And Maduro is out there. He says he's got a phone that the West can't even penetrate with Huawei technologies. He's got millions of people ready to fight the militias. And I think Trump is trying to keep Marco Rubio happy. And there are, again, divisions within the Trump administration. He's trying to please the Likudniks and the Zionists. And that's what the whole issue with the protests on the campuses is. The Ivy League schools, they don't really serve a domestic purpose, okay? The Ivy League schools are there for an international purpose. People from all over the world, especially the developing world, they go to Harvard and Yale and Columbia University, and they learn that America is a great place to do business, and that the United States is a free and open society where, yeah, we might support Israel, but you know what? We have protests. Muslims here openly protested and disagree with it because we're a pluralistic society. So the Ivy League schools, for intelligence purposes, they need to show the world that there's room for anti-Israel Americans. That they need that, except their trustees and their alumni are overwhelmingly Zionists. Right. And in fact, it's interesting because the Ivy League schools have quotas, racial quotas. Right. There are so many people of color there. There are so many white people there. There are so many. And among the whites at Harvard and Yale and Columbia, it is overwhelmingly Jews. There is no quota for Jews. And so among whites, there are barely any non-Jewish whites at these schools. And so the trustees and the alumni associations and the donors are overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And they don't want there to be any anti-Israel protests on the campuses. And they are adamant about this. However, the intelligence agencies need that. If they're going to bring people from the Muslim world, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Indonesia and Malaysia to the United States and court them as allies, they need them to see that the USA is friendly to Muslims and friendly to people who don't agree with Israel. And so you have this weird situation where the Ivy League schools are trying to serve two masters, essentially. And that's the situation that we've got. And so the Muslim Brotherhood and the Democratic Socialists of America, on the one hand, they're trying to maintain a relationship that the USA uses for its regime change wars. On the other hand, Trump and his allies are trying to please the Likudniks and the hard Israeli right. It's a very, very odd situation playing out on our campuses.
I do get that. But what does that have to do with him potentially attacking Venezuela? I mean, I don't care if he's trying to appease Marco Rubio. You're effectively threatening another country. Yeah. I watched when Obama effectively was trying to please Saudi Arabia, placate Saudi Arabia because he wanted to get the deal done with Iran, the JCPOA. And he knew full well that Saudi Arabia was lying about the war against Yemen being a week or 2 weeks or however long he thought it was going to be, and greenlit that war, knowing it was going to be bad because he wanted to didn't have Saudi Arabia getting involved and effectively putting the kibosh on the JCPOA, a deal that only lasts for another 4 years, give or take. I guess I'm saying Donald Trump is the president of the United States, not Marco Rubio. Rubio can be dismissed if Rubio is going to take issue with the policy of the U.S. There are plenty of people. Hell, get Douglas McGregor, right? McGregor would be all in on this policy in regards to the State Department. That's not a good excuse for why the president is threatening another country while simultaneously, or for that matter, even attacking Iran, while simultaneously making this argument, I'm going to go after Obama, or let's say Obama people, or people in Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, Brennan, et cetera, for creating lies about Russiagate, while he creates lies about Iran, or for that matter, lies about Venezuela. Yep. I'm saying that's not an excuse. That's an explanation. but it's not an excuse.
Right. Yeah, it's wrong what he's doing. I mean, there's no question
No.
about it. I mean, Venezuela has the right to its sovereignty. They seized control of their oil. They took control of their natural resources. They're using that oil money to build up an independent economy, and they should have the right to do that as a sovereign nation. And to stand with Russia and China and to, do all the amazing things they've done, like eradicate illiteracy in the country. I mean, I've been to Venezuela and seen the wonders of what has been achieved by their Bolivarian socialist government, and they shouldn't be threatened the way they are at all. But it appears Trump, part of his coalition is this Miami mafia, just like the Likudniks and the Netanyahu crowd in Israel are part of his coalition. And so he's throwing them a bone while he plays one thing or other, and he shouldn't be doing that. He needs the American people to be his allies, because the American people hate John Bolton. The American people don't want these wars that John Bolton, in my book, I talk about Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was never a Trotskyist, but he was an intellectual who became kind of the mentor to a lot of these former Trotskyists. And Leo Strauss and Irving Kristol are considered to be the fathers of the neocon school of thought. One of the most disturbing things about Leo Strauss is he writes extensively about the noble lie, the right, the idea that it's okay to lie, because average people are just too stupid to understand politics. And his favorite TV show was Gunsmoke, a cowboy western from the 1950s, where the good guy wears a white hat and he's all good, and the bad guy wears a black hat and he's all bad, not a single redeeming quality. And Leo Strauss told his followers that's how average Americans should be made to understand world events. It should be that simple for them. We, the smart intellectuals, the philosopher kings, right? He was a Platonist. We should be the ones who analyze the intricacies. But for average people, it should just be as simple as an episode of Gunsmoke. And that it's okay to manipulate and lie to the average people in order to carry out U.S. foreign policy. That is a central belief. John Bolton literally believes it's okay to lie to us to get us into wars, right? It's not a matter of, they lied, oops, they didn't mean to. No, they think it's okay. They have a whole school of thought. Neoconservatism largely teaches that it is okay to lie. And in Sovietology, in the academic schools of Sovietology, where he was trained by these people, they literally believe that, yes, average Americans should be lied to get them to support these wars. And that's what we have to remember. This is a school of people. And, you'll remember John Bolton threatened Maduro, said he was going to send Maduro to Guantanamo Bay. Do you remember that? He was part of Trump's first administration, and he wrecked the peace talks with North Korea. Before, as Donald Trump was preparing to meet with Kim Jong-un, he announced that Libyan options were on the table, and basically, put the North Korean government under threat while the negotiations were taking place. And it actually didn't get a huge amount of attention in U.S. media, but Spain has diplomatic relations with North Korea. And shortly after the peace talks happened on the Korean Peninsula, a number of CIA-linked individuals raided the Spanish embassy of North Korea, stole all kinds of computers, trashed it, and attacked it. So this was, if you attack a country's embassy, that's an attack on the country. That's their territory. Right. The CIA basically attacked and conducted a raid on the North Korean embassy in Spain just to try and hurt the peace talks. So John Bolton is from a wing of the deep state that doesn't want peace with North Korea, doesn't want peace with Russia, doesn't want peace with China, and is trying to prevent the peace talks. And the Alaska summit has the potential to see the war in Ukraine and to see the tunnel over the Bering Sea connecting the United States to the Russian Far East and to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all the economic growth going on in the East. There's all kinds of potential right now, but there's all kinds of great danger. And we're in a weird moment. But I do believe that people like you and me, we have the ability to intervene. We can try and push the forces of good. And if we can push for John Bolton to be prosecuted, and if we can push to support Tulsi Gabbard and what she's doing, we could potentially open the door to lots of good things. So we're in a weird moment. And that's why my book is important. I don't know if you saw, my book is the #1 seller now in the category of radical new thought, radical
that's
thought.
what I want to step into, actually, because I'm fascinated. So give me, if you had to snapshot Trotskyism, just for people to understand it. Let's say you have communism and you may have different schools of communism. What is Trotskyism on that? Just so we have an understanding of what that is, to put it in context, so we can try to make that link to this kind of neoconservatism. Because, by the way, that Straussian argument that you're talking about, It's exactly the argument that Joe Biden makes, exactly the argument that Europeans make. Russia just wants to take over all of Ukraine. Russia just wants to go all throughout Europe. It's like, really, with 150,000 troops, they were going to take over all of Europe. But they were okay lying repeatedly for months or for years on end in order to make that change the reality of things, in order to justify effectively what they were doing. Joe Biden was doing the exact same thing. Obama was doing the exact same thing. Like, that just seems to be standard political fare at this point for the way that these guys operate. All of them are neocons, by the way. It's a hard difference to see between a Lindsey Graham and, let's say, a Joe Biden in the way that they operate, in the way that they think about foreign policy. So what is Trotskyism? Yeah, let's start with that. What is Trotskyism? If you had to give a basic summary definition of it, and I know it's not going to be complete, but just for the audience to have some kind of general idea on the way that you're defining it in order to make the link to neoconservatism.
Trotskyism is a breakaway form of communism. After the Soviet Union was created, after Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power, there was a guy named Trotsky who was part of the Russian government, and he had a falling out with Stalin, with the leadership, and he kind of made a renegade breakaway wing of communism centered around his theory of the permanent revolution. He developed a concept he called the permanent revolution, and he wanted the Soviet Union to just function as a base area, spreading communism all over the world and marching communism into the Western countries. He felt that impoverished countries like Russia, like China, like Vietnam, Cuba, these countries couldn't really have full socialism because they were too poor. And that the only place that it would really matter to have a socialist revolution would be the Western countries. And so they should just kind of function as a base area to spread communism to the Western countries. That was Trotsky's theory, and it was rejected by the people of the Soviet Union. And so Trotsky formed his own kind of renegade brand of communism that presented itself as being kind of a more radical alternative to the official Soviet communism during the 1930s. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. No, it does. Okay. So your point is that Trotsky effectively wanted, because he wanted this kind of permanent revolution, there's a nice symbiosis or a nice crossover between this idea of imperialistic push of liberalism and this need or this want for permanent revolution in regards to socialism. And that on some level, some of these ideas have crossed over.
Not at first, not on the surface. I mean, in theory, they want the opposite, right? I mean, one is saying we want permanent revolution against capitalism. We want to spread an anti-capitalist revolution all over the world. And then the neocons are saying we want to spread the Western system and capitalism all over the world. We want to permanently overthrow the regime. So you'd think that they don't exactly line up on the surface. But you have to go back to the 1930s. Roosevelt was the president for most of the 1930s in the United States. And Roosevelt recognized the Soviet Union. He established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. And he was a big supporter of the labor unions and strikes, created Social Security. And the Communist Party of the United States, that was taking direction from the Soviet Union, they launched what they called the Popular Front, where they kind of toned down a lot of their radicalism, and they played up that they were very patriotic. They would talk about if George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were alive today, they'd be in the Communist Party. Communism is nothing but 20th century Americanism. They had big rallies in Madison Square Garden, with Abraham Lincoln and, the American flag. And then they said racism is un-American. Racism is fascist. And anti-fascism is part of the American spirit. And they built this kind of populist movement that kind of toned down the radicalism, focused on American patriotism. Well, Trotskyism was this wing of communism that still maintained more of the radical image, right? They talked about the workers overthrowing the capitalists, the dictatorship of the proletariat, etc. So to be a communist, especially in New York City, and these folks were called the New York intellectuals, to be a communist in New York City was pretty mainstream. The Communist Party controlled 2 city council seats in Harlem. They had a member of the House of Representatives who supported them, a guy named Vito Marcantonio, who represented Harlem in the House of Representatives. And to be a communist was pretty normal. It meant you were supporting Roosevelt. It meant you were, you wanted better relations with the Soviet Union. You were against fascism, etc. And Trotskyism was like the radical wing of communism. It still talked about, about overthrowing the capitalists and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and used the hammer and sickle. And a lot of the intellectual types found the Communist Party to be a little bit boring. They watered things down. They wanted to be more radical. So there was a magazine called Partisan Review, which was a Communist Party literary academic magazine. It went out of business. They just didn't have enough readers. And so it went out of business, but then it rebooted in 1937, suddenly as no longer affiliated with the Communist Party, as an anti-Stalinist publication. And the professor of philosophy, the head of the philosophy department at NYU, a guy named Sidney Hook, was the editor and was involved in it. And James Burnham was involved in it as well. And a number of these kind of like wealthy college professors took control of this magazine called Partisan Review that was purportedly a communist magazine, but it was supposed to be anti-Stalinist, more radical than the Soviet Union. And a lot of the more radical intellectuals that wanted to be more edgy and thought the Communist Party was toning it down, they formed this magazine, Partisan Review, and they were called the New York Intellectuals. And they followed Trotsky until 1939. So what happened in 1939? There was a pact. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact. And that was because the Soviet Union had been trying to form a global anti-fascist alliance, but the Western countries wouldn't sign on to it. And briefly, France was willing to work with them, but then France cut them off. And so they knew the Nazis were going to invade them. They wanted to buy time. And so they signed a temporary non-aggression pact with the Nazis. And when they did that, U.S. mainstream media went into an anti-Soviet overdrive. And it started calling the Soviet Union the communazis. Right. And they said that, look, the communists are hypocrites. They're always talking about an anti-fascist front, protesting fascism. But now they would sign a pact with Hitler. The leader of the Communist Party was thrown in prison by Roosevelt. Earl Browder was the Communist Party leader, but Roosevelt threw him in prison over the pact. He was temporarily put in prison over a passport violation. And the Communist Party was pretty widely demonized. And the Soviet Union was viewed as kind of betraying the United States by signing this pact. That's when these New York intellectuals, all of a sudden, they had to denounce the Soviet Union, too. They couldn't have anything to do with the Soviet Union. Trotsky had maintained the Soviet Union was what he called a deformed workers' state. It was led by a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy, but it was still socialist in its foundations. But all these New York intellectuals, they had to cut their ties with the Soviet Union completely. It was the pressure of the fact they couldn't go against U.S. foreign policy. They had become communists when that was a trendy thing to be, when the Roosevelt administration was friendly with the Soviet Union, when it was this radical, edgy thing to be in New York circles. But when that put them fundamentally at odds with U.S. foreign policy, they were out of there. And they had to cut their ties with the Soviet Union. And if you read what they wrote about it at the time, and I quote extensively, the struggle for a proletarian party and the arguments that they had with Trotsky, it's wild. It reminds me of today, right? One of their arguments is they say, well, we think for ourselves, right? We think for ourselves. No one can tell us what to think, right? And they say, well, we don't take orders from Moscow, where Stalin was, or from Mexico City, where Trotsky lives. Neither Mexico City or Moscow. We think for ourselves. And their thinking for themselves leads them to support mainstream media, at least, and we hear that over and over and over, right? I'm not brainwashed. I don't watch RT. I think for myself. That's why I repeat the CNN line, right? And it's just the most standard thing, right? And that they're just, they want to go along with the crowd. They want to be on the side of the United States, and the Soviet Union is being widely demonized, and being a Trotskyist would require them to at least kind of mouth support for the Soviet Union. They don't want to do that anymore. And they come out with all kinds of crazy theories. They say, well, the Soviet Union is not capitalist or socialist. They invent this new system called bureaucratic collectivism. It's bureaucrat collectivism. And Nazi Germany is also bureaucrat collectivism. And it's actually worse than capitalism. It's called bureaucrat collectivism. And some of them say, well, it's state capitalism. It's capitalism, except, it's the state that makes the money or whatever. They come up with all these different theories, and they condemn cult of personality and cult of the leader, right? And they say, our intellectual freedom is being threatened, and this organization is authoritarian. They're trying to tell us what to do. They have this big, intense argument that goes on, and the New York intellectuals, they all cut their ties with Trotsky, and they break with Trotsky right as World War II is breaking out, and they just cut their ties. And Partisan Review magazine and Max Shachtman and all these people, they cut their ties with Trotsky. Well, fast forward a decade, right? World War II happens. After World War II, the USA and the Soviet Union are enemies. Once again, right? The Soviet Union is leading, one section of the world in the Cold War, and the U.S. government is against them. And so McCarthyism is happening. The Communist Party's leaders are in jail. The Communist Party is broken up. Well, there's still a layer of people in America, especially in New York City, that are sympathetic to the Communist Party. And at the Waldorf Hotel in New York City, the Soviet Union is part of the UN. And because they're founders of the UN, the Soviet Union is able to have a peace conference at the Waldorf Hotel. And you think about the pressure they were under. I mean, they were basically, the Communist Party was an illegal organization, and all this, but they have an amazing peace conference, the Waldorf Peace Conference of 1949. And Albert Einstein gets up and supports the Soviet Union. And Aaron Copland, the composer, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and all kinds of people have this event at the Waldorf Hotel saying, look, the Soviet Union is right and NATO is wrong. And it's a big deal, this Waldorf Peace Conference. Well, the CIA hires these New York intellectuals, these former Trotskyists, to disrupt the Waldorf Peace Conference. And they set up something called the Committee for Cultural Freedom, which is supposedly a group that's against U.S. foreign policy and the Soviet Union, but it's actually being funded by the CIA to disrupt the Waldorf Peace Conference. And they intercept its mail, and they go to the event and they disrupt it, and they're there and they're saying, well, we're not for the USA, but we never would have anything to do with the Stalinist regime. But the whole time, secretly, they're going back to the CIA and getting their money. And Sidney Hook, this Trotskyist professor, says to the CIA, give me $100 million and I can create a wave of democracy that'll bring down the Soviet Empire. I can find the people. They say their plan is to beat the communists at their own game. And that by speaking against the Soviet Union in the name of leftist and edgy politics, they can create a gap between the kind of people that become communists, intellectuals, anti-racist, activists, other people, and the Soviet Union.
Left.
Yeah. And it's fascinating. So Partisan Review magazine, which is this obscure communist magazine, suddenly it's everywhere. It's all over the college campuses. It is the edgy, radical magazine. And it's critical of McCarthyism, and it's critical of the U.S. military, etc. But it really targets the Communist Party. Anyone who's friendly to the Communist Party, they're an apologist for Stalin. They've got to be opposed. They wage a cancel culture hate campaign against Albert Einstein and against Lillian Hellman, the Broadway playwright. And it's like, we're going to criticize U.S. society and we're going to be edgy, but at the same time, we're going to smear and defame and attack anyone who aligns with the Soviet Union. And the CIA brags about it as being one of their most successful operations, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And who heads it up? This guy, Irving Kristol. And Irving Kristol, he eventually becomes the father of neoconservatism, but, he starts out running the CIA's, leftist program. And his story is, he says in his New York Times obituary, they quote him about why he stopped being a socialist. And he says that he got drafted into the army and that he'd written about the working class, but then he actually met them and he didn't like them. He said, I can't build socialism with these people. They'll just make a racket out of it. And he says he's an intellectual for a reason, and these people are workers for a reason. They're inferior to him. He's a complete elitist, and he really doesn't like the working class. And so the Congress for Cultural Freedom is this CIA program where they're funding all kinds of outlets, all kinds of philosophy books, and all kinds of art galleries. They fund the art of Jackson Pollock, right? Jackson Pollock is this painter who splatters paint on a canvas. Well, a lot of the communist artists are making, art that glorifies the working class and, murals of workers and protests and all of that. And so they come out with the line that, Jackson Pollock, he's just splattering paint on a canvas. That's freedom, right? This art that is promoting workers' struggles and, revolution and all that, that's totalitarian. It's promoting ideas, right? And it's brainwashing people. But Jackson Pollock, that's freedom. You can just splatter your paint. No shapes, no images. That's the freedom of the West, right? And they start, they fund experimental music also, right? That modern music, with emotions and clear themes, etc. That is totalitarian. But experimental music that just kind of leaves you confused, that's helping you think for yourself. It's like, and they develop it. Suddenly it stops being, it's not just that they're leftists who don't like the Soviet Union. They're doing something completely different. And they are kind of defining what it means to be left wing as being a nonconformist, and being one who doesn't go along with the crowd. And there's kind of this contempt for the masses, right? Populism is viewed as a threat, right? And they equate the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And eventually, they don't like the new left, even though they were originally supporters of the civil rights movement, et cetera. As the civil rights movement became the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Movement, as the campus anti-war movement got going, a lot of them, support the Vietnam War because they want to oppose the Stalinists or whatever. And as the campus anti-war movement becomes more and more pro-communist, a lot of them think that Richard Nixon is the better alternative in the 1972 election because he's going to stop the Stalinists and he's going to stop the new left. And, Max Shachtman, in the final years of his life, he endorses Richard Nixon because Richard Nixon is going to stop the commies, and that George McGovern, the Democrat candidate who wants to immediately end the Vietnam War, he's too soft on the communists. And so you have a layer of these former Trotskyists who went to work for the CIA and crafted the new left. And then they from there start becoming conservatives, and they start arguing that in the name of spreading freedom around the world, it is necessary to engage in regime change operations. And Sovietology, this academic field that studies the Soviet Union, becomes dominated by former Trotskyists who are using their kind of leftist values that we got to fight for human rights and we got to fight against dictatorship. They start using their kind of leftist aesthetics and the leftism that they learned from being Trotskyists to craft U.S. foreign policy in a very hawkish way. It's a fascinating story, but what is the continuity there? It's contempt for the people, right?
Well, you can see it.
Average people.
I mean, like you can see the transfer. Like you can, as you were relaying the story, you could kind of see one step leading to the next, where they become statists. Like from the standpoint of the U.S., anything that preserves the state, or anything that's the preservation of the U.S. state, as opposed to these kind of, Soviet Union, anything that inhibits or goes against the U.S. That's what it seems like. I mean, from one step to the next, where we're Trotskyists, we back Trotsky, et cetera, permanent revolution, all of that good stuff. And then it's, okay, we've been paid. Now we're taking this next step into backing the CIA. Then they take this next step, meaning it seems like they've taken so many steps that they've mutated into just something else, which...
Yeah, they still hold on to this kind of contempt for the bulk of American society. They think that average Americans are no good, right? And that just comes across. And that's the interesting thing. And they just kind of hold on to that. And that is something that they really believe. They equate Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union as being exactly the same, which is an absurd thing to say. But they view them both as examples of excessive democracy, right? When average people get too involved in politics, they set up nasty authoritarian states that threaten the great intellectuals. And that's what they believe. They believe that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are both expressions of just the inherent evil of ordinary people. And that's what comes across. And Susan Sontag, she says, communism is nothing but the most successful form of fascism. And she writes about that. And they define fascism as glorifying physical fitness. They define fascism as groups of people acting in coordination. And that they just have this anti-populism, that the masses of people, the bulk of the population, if they get together, they'll set up some kind of authoritarian state that'll threaten our freedom as intellectuals. So we need to rule over the masses of people. We need to lie to them. We need to manipulate them, and we need to do everything we can to make sure they don't get involved in politics because they will take away our ability to rule over them. It's really a bizarre kind of head game, right? It's like, well, we need to make sure there's no democracy. And control the masses of people, because if not, the masses of people will take away our freedom and they'll form a mass. I mean, it becomes like a dog chasing its tail, right? Like, do you want democracy or not? Do you want freedom or not? Right? So we got to take away freedom to make sure that we don't have too much freedom, because the masses of people, if they use that freedom, they'll want to take away our freedom. It starts not making any sense. But, at the core of it is this belief that average people are just bad, that humanity is evil, right? They are anti-human. And they view fascism and communism as rooted in some inherent authoritarian drive within people that makes people dangerous. And that is basically what they believe. And they still believe that. And they believe that it's the duty of the United States to overthrow governments that they would equate with Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union, and to create a society where the kind of elite intellectuals can rise up to the top without being interfered with. And that's what they believe. And that's neoconservatism. And it's interesting because that is largely a view that you could argue is rooted in Friedrich Nietzsche and his talk of philosophical irrationalism. Friedrich Nietzsche, he argued that, there were some people that are just superior. He called them the Übermenschen, right? The superior ones. And he argued that they are persecuted by the mob, by the average people. And that the Übermenschen doesn't believe in objective truth and thinks he can invent his own truth with his own mind. And the Übermenschen doesn't want to be restricted by the rules and traditional morality, right and wrong, etc., and writes his own moral and ethical code. And that any attempt to say that right and wrong do exist, any attempt to say that objective truth does exist, is actually totalitarianism, and it's the mob trying to threaten the Übermenschen and hold back the Übermenschen. And so the Übermenschen is a hero by deconstructing, by just taking things apart, and that's the role that an ethical person plays, is they take apart and they deconstruct narratives. Right? This is postmodernism. Right? You talk about postmodernism; it's the idea that deconstruction and just taking apart narratives and taking apart narratives and destroying any notion of truth, any notion of right and wrong, is the only heroic role that one can play in history. This is what the neocons believe, and it's philosophical irrationalism. And it's interesting because this is also what the new left believes. These people created the new left, and then they became neocons. It's like they're the same folks. And it is this worship of the individual, this contempt for society above all else. And it really defines U.S. foreign policy. And the American people have rejected it. But these people have a grip over the intelligence agencies. They have a grip over the academic institutions that train the people that craft U.S. foreign policy. The American people have rejected them, and we need to talk about it, right? And now as I see Tulsi Gabbard going after John Bolton and going after the Russia Gators, we have to talk about who these folks are. We have to talk about who the neocons, the former Trotskyists, and who they are and where they came from.
But these sound also just like liberals. Like in many respects, they also sound like liberals. I mean, take out domestic policy for the moment. Like whether you want healthcare, whether you don't want healthcare, whether you want, $15 an hour minimum wage or not. Let's say those are items that you add to it. But let's take those out. At the core basics of it, how is this different than any rando Democrat? As opposed to, like, if you make an argument and say, hey, it is perfectly okay to overthrow Libya, sodomize Gaddafi with a machete, and you have Hillary Clinton giggling, we came, we saw, he died. Okay, how's it different than John Bolton? I don't see the difference.
Yeah. And
what's methodology, mindset?
Yeah, well, what does it mean to be conservative? That raises some questions, right? In America, to be a conservative has just kind of come to mean you're a worshiper of money. You're a worshiper of capitalism, right? But conservatism generally means traditionalism, right? It means you love the family, you love the nation, you love the community, and you view liberals as kind of taking those things apart by pushing their radical individualism. That's what conservatism traditionally means. It doesn't mean that in America anymore. It just means you worship capitalism, you worship the free market, and maybe you like these wars because they'll spread capitalism, they'll spread the free market, they'll oppose the commies or whatever. And that American conservatism, and this has been pointed out by a number of people, American conservatism is really kind of an invention. It's something that was invented during the time of McCarthyism. It was this kind of ideology of anti-communism that was kind of a hodgepodge of different, free market ideology, the celebration of the free market, anti-communism, maybe some flag waving, maybe some, Bible thumping or whatever. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really have anything that it really stands for. And this is, the new right, the neoconservatives, as conservatism is being reinvented during the Cold War, it becomes something that's not really conservative, so to speak. And especially if you're spreading revolution all over the world and tearing down different nations, and you're spreading free trade all across the planet. And if on top of that, you're connecting the whole world with free trade, and and if you're doing it in the name of feminism and liberating the women and liberating LGBT, it doesn't sound very conservative to me. But that's what kind of American conservatism has meant. And what's weird is, like, as you pointed out, the Democrats believe this too. And that it used to be during the Cold War, the USA fought communist governments on the basis of them being anti-Christian, of the basis of them opposing the free market. But during the 80s and 90s, they realized that to sell these wars, you had to hijack leftist narratives, make it about feminism, Make it about protecting the women. Use, instead of having it be a U.S. invasion, have it be a color revolution where there's people in the streets fighting for freedom. And that hijacking the aesthetics of leftism is a much more effective way of selling war. And that's the neocons. They were leftists. They were Trotskyists. And they realized that the aesthetics and the feelings that accompanied their leftist politics were more effective in building the case for war than traditional conservative war narratives.
I guess I'm saying, Caleb, that this seems to be just American policy. Like, I know you're saying neoconservatism, but that neoconservatism label seems to fit very well with either political party. I mean, let's take it to Europe, for example. The overthrow of Georgia, where they were trying to have a color revolution in Georgia. The overthrow of Ukraine, where they were having the color revolution in Ukraine. The way the European Union is effectively bigfooting the various governments, either the ADF that's taking place in Germany, Marine Le Pen's party, the National Rally, where they're effectively putting people or trying to threaten to put people in jail in order to get them off the political stage. They seem to be perfectly okay with creating myths in order to justify the things that they're doing politically, and the characterization that you are effectively making about neoconservatives that fit firmly within both political parties. Yeah. Again, I could bring up the Hillary Clinton thing. We can go to the Joe Biden issue. That seems to fit as comfortably with a Lindsey Graham, a John Bolton, et cetera, as with a Hillary Clinton, a Joe Biden. All of these people have very similar ideologies in regards to what they want to do around the globe, and this notion of spreading American power around the globe. All of these people were okay with knocking over Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and trying to go after Iran. That was a mutual project that was taking place by both political parties. So, I mean, are we just using the term neoconservatives in the context that can be either political party, either political faction that seem to just both agree that this is American policy at this point?
I mean, neoconservatism refers to a specific school of people, but Anne Marie Slaughter, you read her writings, she's a neocon, and she was Hillary Clinton's top advisor. She runs the New America Foundation, and you read what she wrote in Foreign Affairs in her essay on the power of populism about how populist regimes are the main threat. Populism, not authoritarian regimes, populist regimes that build kind of mass movements to back them up. They're the main threat. And that the USA must support revolutions around the world to spread the open international system. I mean, that's neoconservatism. And what's weird is that as things change, the financial crisis was really the moment where the neocon messaging in the Republican Party kind of died, right? 2008, it became very, very hard to hold the Republican Party together and have the Republican Party win elections with neocon messaging. And that's when we saw a shift of these kind of regime change activists and big oil, ExxonMobil and others, just putting their support behind the Democratic Party instead. For a number of reasons. The demographics of the United States have changed. The economy was doing a lot worse, and that traditional neoconservatism kind of relies on this old-fashioned, my country, right or wrong. If you don't like it here, why don't you move to another country? Don't fix it if it ain't broke. And you can't do that anymore. I mean, people lost their homes all across the heartland of America. People felt that the government was corrupt, and that traditional Cold War neoconservatism, after the political crisis of the 1960s, you had a kind of a rebranding of what it meant to be a conservative or a Republican that was very effective, that basically said, the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement and all these hippies protesting, well, they need to cut it out and get over it. And, America is the greatest country in the world. And if you got a problem with that, you should move to another country. And that was the neocon messaging style. And it just fell out. I mean, it just wasn't going to work anymore. It wasn't popular. And the neocons were kind of out of power. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, he disapproved of the axis of evil speech that George W. Bush gave. That was kind of viewed as the height of neoconservative influence, because Bush listed three governments, North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, and he said they constitute an axis of evil. And Brzezinski, who is definitely an advocate of opposing Russia, worked in the Carter administration, et cetera, he denounced that because he said, look, that's not strategic. If you just declare governments to be evil, you can't negotiate with them ever. And that Obama, he was largely around Zbigniew Brzezinski and kind of the geostrategic liberal school. It was a little bit different than the neocons, right? That they have a little bit of a different approach. They're more about cultivating proxies, to utilize them. People like the Muslim Brotherhood and using them to carry out regime change operations. They kind of play a global chess game where they align with different forces, they manipulate different forces. That's the more liberal geopolitical school of foreign policy. Whereas the neocons, they are on a mission to destabilize and overthrow governments. It's a moral question for them. There's an axis of evil, and they have got to spread Western values by overthrowing it. And Obama's presidency was kind of, as the neocons had kind of lost their grip, they were kind of on the defensive. And Obama, who studied at Columbia University under the Brzezinski School, right? The Columbia University School of International, Relations. That is very much where Brzezinski comes out of. They came in and they were saying, look, the neocon way of doing things, this kind of self-righteous crusade, it's not a winning strategy. But still, I mean, for decades, they had dominance in how people were trained in foreign policy. And, the Hillary Clinton State Department was full of neoconservatives, et cetera. So, I mean, there are different strategies and layers within our deep state, and they ultimately want the same thing. I mean, they want to push back the power of Russia and China, secure the dominance of Wall Street around the world, but there are different strategies about how to do so, I think, and that the neocon formula kind of lost its ability to win elections and to dominate the Republican Party with the rise of Obama. And so there's been kind of a reshuffling. And you could argue that wokeism is almost like a rebrand of neoconservatism, right? It's rebranding neoconservatism, not to sell it to white middle class people in the suburbs, but rather to sell it to young urban professionals in the cities, right? And young hipster kind of woke people. It's the same thing. We're on a crusade to spread freedom, except it presents itself a little bit differently. And it used to be that, the young urban professionals were more free thinking and critical of U.S. foreign policy. Whereas it was, your average, folks in the suburbs, your white working class, white middle class folks in the suburbs that were the ones that said, love it or leave it and supported all the wars. Now it's flipped. Now your young urban hipsters think that they're smart because they read the New York Times and they think that we have to oppose Russia. Whereas your folks in the suburbs, they think that, it's not our business and things are not going too well over here and living standards are dropping. And so maybe we should focus on America first. And so it's weird. And I've talked on here before about how I hated college, but my whole family told me, college is going to be amazing. You're going to love college. Well, yeah, if I had gone to the college that my parents went to in the 60s, yeah, I would have loved it because college played a different role. College used to be where people thought more critically. Now, in our new age, college is where you go to get vetted to make sure you repeat the party line. And among the population at large, people are questioning things. People are looking into ideas they call conspiracy theories and challenging official narratives. But in the academic institutions, you're vetted. You're told that, you are made sure that you will repeat the party line. And so like the role of the institutions and academia has changed. A lot has changed in U.S. society. This isn't the country it was during the Cold War, and a lot of things have just kind of shifted in the role that they play.
Caleb, this is fascinating. This is completely fascinating. Yeah, because you're right. On its face, these two things seem opposite. But you can see how this kind of mutation took effect, where it transferred from one thing into something else. I mean, what do you say about this notion of just being, these are just issues of power? How do you maintain power? How do you project power? And the ideology that you've convinced yourself of in order to kind of project that power. Because if they hate people, then what is the point of taking over another country, right? And yet they do. And they come up with the justification to take over this country and that country and this kind of geopolitical expansion of this game of primacy that they seem to want to effect. This is both political parties. This seems to be the American ethos in the way that we operate around the world. And I agree with you, the neoconservatism thing, it's an interesting pivot from one to the other. And you could see this kind of line going from one to the other. But ultimately, this really is just about power, right?
Yeah, I mean, when it really gets down to it, it's almost like they worked backwards, right? They already knew what the conclusion would be, but the question is, how do we reach that conclusion? So an ideology is made up kind of to reach the conclusion. The world at this point is ruled by Wall Street and London, and they don't want competitors, right? China used to be one of the poorest countries in the world. Now they make half the world's steel. Now Huawei makes way better phones than Apple. China's now a competitor. So we got to push China off the stage because we want Wall Street to dominate the world. Russia, at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, they were a very poor country, but Putin fixed things up, and he, put oil and gas at the center of their economy. And now Russia is selling oil and gas all over the world, and they're competing with ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron, and they've lifted people out of poverty, and they're part of the Eurasian Economic Union and this new economy that's rising. So, big oil and the big bankers in the West say we got to push Russia off the stage. And so if you want to advance in academia, if you want to advance in mainstream media, you say what the people with the money want to hear, which is we got to get those Russians, we got to get those Chinese, we got to get those Venezuelans, we got to get those Iranians. And what really happened is that there was a layer of people that were calling themselves communists, that were Trotskyite communists, that learned that they could take aspects of what they believed as radicals and use them to serve the power structure. And they could do so effectively, and that to advance their careers and to get the grant money and the book deals and to get the appointments as advisors to government officials and to get the good jobs training the future State Department employees. They could take some of the values that they'd learned from Trotskyite communism and apply them to what the power structure wanted to hear. And it was a very effective formula. Who would have thought, right? You would have thought that just hating communism, just hating anything to do with Marxism would be the effective way of doing it. But if you take some of the principles that Trotsky believed in, some of the principles of Marx and Lenin, and you turn them on their head and you weaponize them to serve the Western system, why you can become the best, the best preacher of and the best mobilizer and the best effective analyst for the Western system. And that's kind of what they realized, and that there's a weird game of that, right? They talk about jujitsu, right? The fighting style, it's where you use your enemy's strength against him, right? And that there's an element of that, right? Where it's like, the one side does something, so the other side imitates it and does it another way. And you see this in all kinds of fields of politics and art and all of that. As people are competing with each other and all of that, they draw from each other. They take one thing that the other side is doing and they reverse it and they imitate it. I mean, these are the games that are played. There's a duality in the universe, right? That's Marx's the dialectic, right? That there's two sides clashing, and as they clash, they reinvent each other, they imitate each other, and this is part of the game. And that neoconservatism was kind of, as the USA was fighting communism around the world, they developed their own kind of weird revolutionary communistic worldview to fight communism. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the universe, the duality that exists. And that's how the USA was able to win the Cold War. Instead of fighting communists on the basis of communism bad, capitalism good, they took some of the feelings and emotions and passion that communists appealed to and weaponized it against the communists. And that's how they were able to win the Cold War. And that's where neoconservatism comes from.
I'm curious, do you think they know that? Do the John Boltons of the world know that ultimately elements of his ideas because you're right. Like, I have a knife, you have a knife. The only difference is why we're using it. I'm using it for defense, you're using it to attack, etc. In which case, I'm more right because I'm defending. Like, meaning tools of the trade are effectively the same. The tools at your disposal in any kind of war and any kind of fight are very similar. It's usually the ideas that are different. I'm curious, do you think that these guys know what you just explained very well, by the way, in this hour that we've had together?
Well, their professors did. I mean, John Bolton was never a Trotskyist. He was a young guy who supported the Vietnam War, went into the military, went into academia, and he was trained by former Trotskyists, and he was trained by the neocons who ran the Sovietology schools. They certainly knew what they were doing. And I'm sure, they taught, when they were teaching Sovietology, they taught the Soviet ideology, and they said, this is what the Soviets believe. And, and they taught about the Stalin-Trotsky disagreement. So I wouldn't be surprised. John Bolton probably knows this history to some degree or other. I don't know if he cares as much. His professors probably cared. His professors and the people who set up, what is now called neoconservatives, they cared to some degree. There's a great PBS documentary called Arguing the World that kind of traces the career of four of these, New York intellectuals, Irving Howe, who ended up founding DSA, and Irving Kristol, who ended up, being the father of neoconservatism. And it kind of traces their trajectory. So I think they know this history to some degree or other, but I don't think they care. They're concerned about their careers, right? It's about getting ahead. It's about getting your face on CNN. It's about getting the book deals. It's about getting appointed and getting good jobs in DC and in the administration. And, you know, these neocons had a clever way of doing it. They knew leftism, and they were able to kind of pull what they knew from leftism and apply it to advance their careers in the American imperialist power structure. I think that's really all there is to it.
Caleb, I'm illuminated. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for this. And just so the audience can see your book, the name of the book is right here. Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. This is just a taste of what is in the book. He gives a good breakdown in this video, but the book is going to go into far more detail to explain how that link is established, how that link is created. Caleb, great work, as always. I always tell people your breadth of knowledge is always impressive, man. Thank you for this. I really appreciate
Sure.
it. You be
always
okay?
A pleasure.
Oh, by the way, just so the audience would know, I almost let you go without giving your bio. Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author, and of course, new book, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives, the whole story. You can also find Caleb. He created the Center for Political Innovation. Definitely check them out there. This was, well, they have protests, they have marches, they have all sorts of rallies all over the United States. Caleb, you are fantastic, man. Thank you.